Home to over 1 billion people, the Republic of India is quickly becoming one of the most important strategic actors in all of Eurasia. Situated between the Himalayas, Hindu Kush, and the Arakan Mountains, the world's largest democracy is viewed by many as the next up-and-coming world power. Its position between the Strait of Malacca, Strait of Hormuz, and the Bab el-Mandab Strait mean that its importance for the maritime security of the Indian Ocean region will only grow as commerce continues through these choke points. Its shared borders with the nuclear powers of Pakistan and China make it a worthwhile partner for those seeking to project power and stability into this volatile region. These factors and more would lead one to believe that the U.S. would be a close ally of such a country rising in strategic and geopolitical importance. But it was not until recently, within the last 20 years even, that India and the U.S. began entering into a geostrategic partnership. Why is this? On paper, the United States and India ought to be natural allies. One is the largest democracy by population size, and the other is the most powerful democracy in the world. Both countries share a common heritage as former British colonial possessions, and English is one of India's official languages. And most importantly, both have taken on an adversarial relationship with the rising People's Republic of China. Whether the region is in Kashmir, Yunnan, or the South China Sea, both the US and India find common cause in resisting Chinese pushes into these frontiers. With all these relevant facts clarified, this begs the question, why was it not until 2016 that India was labeled a major defense partner of the United States? Why has it only been as recently as the end of the Cold War in 1991 that New Delhi has made a concerted effort to develop a strategic partnership with Washington? What took so long? To understand the reason for India's recent move toward the U.S., one must have a firm grasp of India's historical origins as a state as well as its traditional geopolitical orientation as a country. While India did not gain formal independence until 1947, the most important facets of its current identity took shape during the period of British colonization and rule. Prior to British colonization, the subcontinent's most powerful state was the Mughal Empire, but even they were never capable of controlling all of what is today modern India. For much of its history, India was instead divided as a patchwork of states, each one identifying more with their local ethnic clans or religious customs than any later conceptualized pan-Indian identity. The Europeans used these divisions to their advantage in their quest to gain territory and trade agreements when they first began arriving in the late 15th century. Spurred on by a desire to bypass the Ottoman monopoly on eastern spice trade, European powers secured a network of trading facilities up and down the subcontinent's coast. This period of limited colonization would continue for nearly 250 years, and would only be ended with a decisive expansion of British control over the subcontinent. London's presence in the region did not begin as a matter of imperial strategy, but as a private venture, most notably by the British East India Company. Chartered in 1600, the company was tasked with maintaining and expanding British trading presence in the East, which had the most lucrative spice markets available. It performed this role with a reliable, if not unnoteworthy, success, but its importance to the British Empire would be forever altered thanks to its success at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 during the 7 Years' War. Outnumbered 3,000 to 50,000, the British were able to decisively win the battle against the Bengali and French forces and secure control over Calcutta and much of Bengal. This battle would be a turning point for British expansion in the region, as it proved just how technologically advanced Europeans had become relative to their Indian counterparts. Through subsequent wars, the company not only secured large territorial concessions from other parts of the subcontinent, but also had success in pushing out their European rivals, thus gaining a monopoly on Indian trade and resources. This monopoly on Indian trade would result in Great Britain possessing not just the rich resources of India, but its massive manpower pools, which were used to further expand British power across Asia. From the Battle of Plassey to the mid-1850s, British power in Asia was based out of the East India Company holdings of the Indian subcontinent. British expansion into the Middle East, Malaysia, Burma, Afghanistan, and even China were all conducted through its crown jewel that was its Indian Empire. Of particular note was British India's role in exporting opium into the lands of the Qing dynasty, which led to its destabilization and subsequent division by Japanese and Western powers. This antagonistic relationship between British India and China would be foundational going forward, as it was China that possessed the largest markets in exotic goods that were coveted by European traders and merchants. Access to Chinese markets in Far Eastern sphere of influence was so important to the British that they took multiple territorial concessions along China's coasts and rivers in an effort to protect their economic interests in the region. London also claimed Chinese territory in the Himalayan mountains, further expanding their reach into the inland Chinese provinces of Tibet and Yunnan. While British India's influence predicated on its control of the seas and maritime routes linking China to India, there still existed land frontiers across which both sides fought for influence, thus proving the dual threat a unified Indian subcontinent posed to Chinese power. London's most valuable colony was not without its own vulnerabilities, however. Given that Britain derived its strategic advantage thanks to its global naval superiority, threats to its control over India would implicitly have to be land-based if they had any chance of succeeding in pushing the British out. These land-based threats did not historically come from the east, but rather from the west and the north. Whether these invasions were the Persians, Greeks, Arabs, or Turco-Mongols like the Mughals, they all utilized the northwest corridor through modern-day Iran and Afghanistan to invade and threaten the subcontinent. Once past the Indus River and the Thar Desert, there are little to no significant geographic features that shield the Indian core. Any power that could secure the Indus River Plain and the Thar Desert were thus in a strategically advantageous position to threaten the subcontinent, and this partly explains how the Mughals were able to control such a large swath of Indian territory. But with the ascendancy of the British and the dissolution of the Mughals, there existed no land-based force that could threaten the British, right? Wrong. Though not immediately proximate to India, Tsarist Russia's dominant position in the Central Asia and Caucasus at the time meant that it had the most potential to threaten British control over India. While the significance and extent of this threat is still debated to this day, the so-called Great Game conducted by the British and the Russian empires for control of Central Asia had direct implications for the security of Britain's Indian empire. St. Petersburg's desire for warm water ports in the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean, as well as its own Central Asian rivalry with Great Britain, meant that dislodging London's crown jewel colony would have cascading benefits for the land-based Russians. Fearing Russian control of Iran and Afghanistan, the British mitigated these vulnerabilities by pursuing an active foreign policy so as to both rebuff and accommodate the Russians in their expanding Asian holdings. These policies ranged from military excursions into Afghanistan to gain effective territorial control to treaties and agreements with the Russians stipulating spheres of influence and agreed-upon borders. The threat posed by the subcontinent's northwestern flank would prove persistent throughout its period of British rule. Even after the 1857 Sepoy Rebellion saw the holdings transferred from the British East India Company directly to the Crown of England, Great Britain continued to grapple with the risk of Russian encroachment. However, these issues would be solved with more accommodation and agreement in the form of the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which specified spheres of influence and control over portions of Iran and Afghanistan. Though neither the Iranians nor the Afghanis were consulted on the matter, the agreement would lay out the foundation for the strategic partnership that would define Indo-Russian relations for the latter half of the 20th century. Great Britain also neutralized maritime threats from the southeast with the signing of the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1902, thereby securing its Asian holdings on both flanks. Following these landmark accords, British India would be threatened during World War I from its northwestern flank in the form of German intelligence operations hoping to instigate the Iranian and Afghanis to invade British India on the side of the Central Powers. Though these operations never actually amounted to a Central Powers attack on India, the evolution of threats to British India from Russia to other tertiary powers had a lasting effect on British planning and strategy for the Far East. Despite emerging victorious and gaining new territories from the Paris Peace Conference, World War I would seriously weaken London's ability to control its global empire. Even if one ignores the loss of life and capital the war cost, the diversion of resources toward the war effort had allowed regional powers such as the United States and Japan to make inroads into former British spheres of influence, particularly in the form of exported goods to markets in South America and East Asia. Japanese power in East Asia grew in part due to their aggressive policies in China, which drew the ire of the Americans. Following the increased Japanese provocations in China and pressure from Washington to break the alliance, London was forced to choose between the Americans or the Japanese. Recognizing the ascendant nature of America's global status as well as their similar geopolitical orientations, London severed their partnership with Tokyo in 1923. This forced move away from its partnership with Japan as well as the hardships wrought on by the Great War meant that a new maritime strategy had to be developed for protecting British India. This new strategy was developed with two key assumptions in mind, those being the local superiority of Japanese naval forces and the strategic location of British Singapore. Despite dwarfing the Japanese Navy in aggregate numbers, a combined Japanese fleet would easily be able to overpower local British stations in the east. With this reality clarified, the British strategy instead predicated on fortifying and outfitting Singapore as a naval base to deter Japanese aggression towards British India. Its strategic location on the Strait of Malacca meant that any Eastern naval force seeking to attack British India would necessarily have to control Singapore if they wished safe passage through the narrow strait. This so-called Singapore strategy assumed that captured British colonies such as Hong Kong or British Borneo would need to wait for a concentrated fleet to move from British home waters to be relieved from the Japanese occupation. Once these posts were taken back, the concentrated fleet would move on to seize Japanese assets in China and blockade the Japanese home islands. The Singapore strategy was thus a defensive and offensive plan that sought to bottleneck Japanese naval forces in the South China Sea away from British India until a large enough naval force could be brought to bear in the Far East. When push came to shove, this strategy fell flat on its face. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, it would take only 2 months for Singapore to fall to the Japanese and for the naval route to India to be wide open. Underestimation of Japanese capabilities as well as poor use of intelligence led to what Winston Churchill called, quote, the worst disaster in Britain's military history. Seizing upon their strategic initiative, the Japanese were able to launch an invasion of Burma, directly threatening a significant portion of British India's empire. Even though the invasion would eventually be driven back into Siam, the British would never recapture Singapore during the war. In effect, the invasion of Burma and capture of Singapore by the Japanese was a confirmation of Great Britain's inability to defend its holdings east of Suez. Though the British were able to work together with the Soviets to secure the traditional northwestern land-based threat to India, its failure to secure the maritime choke point of Singapore meant that it could no longer safeguard its holdings in Asia from future threats coming from the Far East. That it took American naval power to finally restore order to British colonies was a clear indication that nations of Southeast Asia would look to Washington not London, for maritime security guarantees. With their colonial overlord no longer capable of defending its holdings, Indian nationalists began pressing even harder for independence from London. With financial problems mounting and their position in Asia becoming increasingly untenable, it would just be 2 years after the war's conclusion that Viscount Mountbatten, last Governor-General of the British Raj, was given the order from the newly elected Attlee government to bring about partition. With Burma and Ceylon gaining their independence just a year later, British rule on the subcontinent came to an abrupt end just shy of 200 years since the monumental Battle of Plassey. As one might expect of a rushed decolonization plan, the partition of India was problematic in several different areas. Despite the subcontinent being composed of a mosaic of different ethnic, religious, and culturally distinct peoples, the British originally desired to create as unified an Indian state as possible. Whether this is due to their own disregard for India's diversity or with future geopolitical goals in mind, a unified India almost did result if not for the efforts of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who lobbied for the creation of a separate majority Muslim state that would be known as Pakistan. Mountbatten therefore allocated areas of the Raj with the largest proportion of Muslims to this Pakistan, with the rest going to the majority Hindu India. The princely states that were not directly administered by Great Britain were given the option of independence or joining India or Pakistan. This plan seemed reasonable enough on paper. However, if painting lines on a map and declaring them sovereign states were this simple, then there wouldn't be so many geopolitical disputes and conflicts present in the post-colonial world. Despite Mountbatten having until summer of 1948 to bring about Indian partition, he announced his plan for the partition in June of 1947, nearly a whole year earlier than was expected by most Indians and British officials. His announced date for partition to occur, August 15th, gave just 2 months for both the Indians and the Pakistanis to prepare for statehood. If this weren't bad enough, the news of the imminent partition resulted in massive population migrations from the would-be religious minorities in the two states. Millions of Hindus who found themselves within Pakistan and Muslims within India took part in this demographic transfer that brought about enormous death and suffering. An estimated 200,000 to 1 million people died in this massive transfer, and even those that survived were left as refugees in their new country. The issues facing the two new countries wouldn't stop there, though. While there existed issues with population transfers from the start, India and Pakistan also began the relationship with conflict over territory. Faced with the same choice presented to other princely states, the Hindu ruler of the majority Muslim Jammu and Kashmir opted for independence. But following his ousting of his pro-independence prime minister, Pakistani militias feared the province would join India, and so they invaded and occupied significant portions of the territory. India offered their own military support, and thus began the First Indo-Pakistani War and the Kashmir conflict as we know it today. Control over Kashmir wasn't just a matter of pride or religious rivalry either. Kashmir's strategic location to India's north meant that its control by Delhi was a non-negotiable. If Pakistan were to gain Kashmir, it would be in total control of India's northwestern sector, an area that had been historically vital to India's defense as a unified state. It was from this northwest region that the Mughals, Russians, and Germans all attempted to threaten the Indian heartland, and thus India sees it as a geopolitical priority. Kashmir's position also lends itself to being used as a connection to China. Though the terrain is about as inhospitable and desolate as it gets, this crucial link between Pakistan and China means that neither country must necessarily rely on maritime trade access to the other, and that cooperation in the region is possible. As was detailed earlier in the video, China's historic role as India's geopolitical rival in Southeast Asia means that a Beijing-Islamabad axis is a natural manifestation of the old adage, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." The independence of India, and specifically its relationship with Pakistan, can thus be accurately described as foundational. How culpable the British were for this conflict is debatable, but the fact remains that the tensions that existed then and still exist today were very much baked into the cake of the partition. Humanitarian issues with the partition notwithstanding, Pakistan's position on India's northwestern flank made conflict between the two nations all but inevitable. While the religious differences do play well into the propaganda and nationalistic differences that exist between the two nations, the fact is that this rivalry is chiefly the result of geopolitics. Given the Northwest's traditional orientation as a land-based gate into India, Pakistan's control over the area meant that India would forever have to maintain vigilance against the Pakistanis. Even more crucially is that the India-Pakistan conflict would prove ripe for exploitation by external powers hoping to enact their own agendas for the region. In short, the independence of India may have helped it gain political autonomy, but it would inherit serious geopolitical problems for the future. India was thus thrust into statehood amid conflict with its neighbor and huge population transfers taking place throughout the subcontinent. These issues would have been enough to tie down even the most developed countries, but India had an even greater problem to negotiate on top of its domestic issues, that being its place in the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. A democracy from its inception, one would expect India to be solidly within the Western camp alongside America, Western Europe, and its East Asian allies. But this assumption is one built on the idea that the Cold War was purely an ideological battle, when in reality there were significant geopolitical concerns underlying the competition. Indeed, though India was a democracy, its relationship with the U.S. was not one of strategic partnership. Washington did provide monetary and agricultural support during the famines early in the country's independence, but Nehru, India's first prime minister, instead set the nation on a course of neutrality with regards to the Cold War. Joining with other post-colonial states and developing nations, Nehru and the heads of the state of Egypt, Indonesia, Ghana, and Yugoslavia announced the creation of the non-aligned movement as a bloc to withstand both Western and Eastern aggression. Neither an economic partnership nor a military alliance, the non-aligned movement was instead a grouping of nations who felt threatened by the competition and proxy conflicts being waged by the United States and the Soviet Union. Hoping to avoid getting roped into the fight, the non-aligned movement stressed the sovereignty of their newly independent states, as well as their commitment to resisting imperialism from any potential aggressors. This appeal for neutrality was a persuasive one, given that most of the members were former colonial subjects. Like India, most were undergoing the radical changes brought on by independence, and thus a global great power struggle between Washington and Moscow was not something they wanted to get involved in. Of course, these lofty goals of resisting Western hegemony and power were little more than convenient talking points. Most of the non-aligned nations would eventually be involved in the Cold War in some sort of fashion, and non-aligned states even fought wars amongst each other. Thus, the extent to which India's pivot to neutrality was influenced by Nehru's idealism is questionable. Undergirding this idealistic neutrality were the geopolitical realities that India found itself in. Dependent on the naval security that was provided by the Americans since the Second World War, India had an interest in maintaining a good relationship with the United States. Direct partnership with Moscow would leave it vulnerable to the United States in its virtually uncontested control of the world's oceans and supply lines. But being flanked by Pakistan to its northwest and even further beyond by Russia and Central Asia, India did not want to draw the ire of the Russians that had been such a huge strategic threat to the British control of the subcontinent. Moscow could tolerate New Delhi's antagonistic attitude towards communist China, but an outright partnership with Washington would leave India surrounded by land-based adversaries on 3 different fronts. These two geopolitical realities, ascendant American naval power and the looming Soviet Union, meant that India could not join with one without creating an existential threat out of the other. Thus, the winning move for India in the Cold War was simply not to play. Cautious neutrality would be the preferred policy. This doctrine of neutrality was carried out with success for some time. India enjoyed cordial relations with both the United States and the Soviet Union throughout the 50s and 60s. During the Sino-Indian border conflict of 1962, both Moscow and Washington signaled their support for New Delhi against Beijing's aggression, showing just how effective India's neutrality had been in staving off great power exploitation in the country. But the successes would be short-lived with the election of Richard Nixon in 1968. Nixon is well known for establishing a close relationship with China to counter the Soviets, but what is less talked about is his relationship with Pakistan and India. Hoping to put pressure on North Vietnam as well as to capitalize on the Sino-Soviet split, which up until that point had been more ideological than geopolitical, Nixon wanted to establish a strategic partnership with Beijing so as to flank Moscow on both sides of its Eurasian periphery. Part of this equation was the U.S. policy on the India-Pakistan conflict. Knowing the traditional competition of Sino-Indian relations, as well as Moscow's historical accommodations with the subcontinent, Nixon opted to establish a close relationship with Pakistan in conjunction with China. Having already feared an Indo-Russian partnership, these diplomatic pursuits essentially turned Nixon's fear into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Flanked by the American strategic presence on all sides, India was forced to turn to Moscow to establish a working relationship with the counterbalance America's growing presence in the region. The result of Nixon's diplomatic excursions would define the geopolitics of the Cold War for the remainder of the Soviet Union's existence. The development of the Washington-Beijing-Islamabad axis and the reflexive Moscow-New Delhi partnership removed any pretenses of the Cold War being a purely ideological struggle. That Communist China, Islamic Pakistan, and capitalist America stood opposed to Communist Russia and democratic India showed the extent to which Nixon had successfully used the aforementioned phrase, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." While these cohesive blocs would never join with each other to attack the other, the strategic balance of power as a result of their formation did give Washington the leverage it needed to negotiate détente with the Soviets and allowed for the Americans to initiate a strategic withdrawal from Vietnam. More pertinent to India itself, the realignment from neutrality to soft support of the Soviets meant that the U.S. could never be the strategic democratic allies some had hoped for. The two largest democracies in the world would remain adrift from one another, and it would not be until the dissolution of the USSR that India-American relations would undergo yet another change in strategic outlook. The collapse of the Soviet Union proved to be the defining event that shifted New Delhi away from Moscow and toward Washington. Having watched their principal geopolitical rival implode, the Americans no longer had qualms about making inroads with the Indians, and thus positive diplomatic relations between the two countries were able to develop. The U.S. still relied on Pakistan as a means to access Central Asia and China for economic benefits, but the retraction of Russian power meant that a broader Eurasian system would need to be facilitated if America was to remain the global hegemon. Thus, a friendly relationship with the world's largest democracy was an obvious prerequisite if Washington was to achieve this goal. Concurrent with this growing Indian-American partnership were two significant trends that would see the relationship grow in size and strategic outlook. These trends were the developing stalemate in the broader Middle East and the rise of China as a regional power in East Asia. With a deteriorating scene in Iraq and a bogged-down presence in Afghanistan, the ability for the Americans to effect change on the region, particularly in Iran, was quickly slipping by. Even more importantly, the American public no longer supported excursions in the region as much as they had during the height of the War on Terror. Pakistan's integral position as Washington's link to Afghanistan was thus called into question, as was the broader India-Pakistan relationship. A hypothetical decline in American presence in Afghanistan would result in a decline in reliance on Pakistan, meaning a greater strategic partnership with India would soon be viable. While these Middle East and Central Asia developments were calling into question the Pakistan-American relationship, so too were events in East Asia putting a strain on Sino-American relations. China's meteoric economic growth, as well as its geopolitical designs on Korea, Taiwan, and the South China Sea, were starting to bring it into conflict with the American security interests in the region. Beijing and Washington had never seen eye to eye on these issues, but the emergent difference was the increased power China now possessed relative to the United States. China had gone from a mostly agricultural-based developing state to possessing the second highest GDP in the world, estimated to overtake the U.S. within a few decades. With its rise in power, China now had the capability to resist American-led world order that had prevented it from achieving its geopolitical goals in East Asia for so long. China began acting on these desires with increasing confidence and consistency. Beijing's claims to the South China Sea, its efforts to get other countries to recognize Taiwan, as well as its unwavering support for the belligerent North Korea, were all actions that Washington could not tolerate if it was to contain Chinese ambitions for East Asian hegemony. These two trends would give the Obama administration the perfect pretext to unveil their new foreign policy initiative, what then Secretary of State Clinton called the Pivot to Asia. Sometimes referred to as the Rebalance to Asia, Obama's Pivot to Asia was a series of desired policies and actions that would amplify and secure American interests in the broader Indo-Pacific region. Growing in strategic importance, this region of Eurasia was one that some felt had been underemphasized in favor of geopolitical interests in Europe or the Middle East. At the heart of the pivot was China, whose aforementioned rise to power was the main impetus for the new shift in strategic outlook. Confronting and engaging China meant strengthening relationships with established American allies like Japan and South Korea, but also featured new partnerships with countries like Vietnam and Myanmar. But among these new partnerships, India stood alone as being the most important land-based ally America would gain. India's historical as well as its geopolitical disposition to compete with China on its Tibetan and southwestern frontiers made it the perfect foil to America's overwhelming sea-based power. India was also a stable democracy, which meant that political relations between the two would not be as scrutinized as America's dealings with some of the more authoritarian nations of the region. For India, a strategic partnership to withstand China was well within their interests as well. Having not experienced the same kind of growth Beijing had achieved, New Delhi knew that it had to rely on the U.S. if it was to resist Chinese forays into its sphere of influence and Himalayan frontiers. Chinese desires for a blue water navy and the naval bases to support it also directly threatened India's commercial autonomy, not too dissimilar from the threat Imperial Japan posed to the British Raj in the Second World War. Access to Middle Eastern energy being their ultimate desire, the Chinese knew that securing a maritime link to the region was crucial, and India was directly in their way of achieving this goal. Thus, the relationship was developed throughout Obama's administration and into Trump's as well. Military agreements were codified, state visits were held, and joint exercises were conducted between America, India, and other regional allies. As one might expect, China did not sit idly by as these machinations unfolded. China's One Belt, One Road initiative was unveiled in part to circumvent the combined naval power of India and its Indo-Pacific rivals. Hoping to build upon the ancient Silk Road that linked Asia to Europe, the Belt and Road project allowed China to build strategic relationships with countries in Central and South Asia, areas once thought to be within India's spheres of influence. India's pivot toward the U.S. also had effects on the Sino-Russian relationship. Having been strained since their split in the 1950s, Moscow and Beijing now had a common interest in working to oppose Washington's encroaching influence. These mutual interests would manifest themselves in an increased economic and military partnership between the two nations, a clear reversal of the previous Sino-Soviet split states through British rule and into independence as a democracy. The political nature of India has changed beyond recognition, yet its geography and inherent features as a nation have remained virtually the same. Cordoned off from Central and East Asia by the Himalayas and straddling the Indian Ocean, India's geography makes the subcontinent a world unto itself. The primary routes of invasion of the region were either from the southern maritime coast or its exposed northwestern flank. These routes would be exploited in one form or another throughout India's unified history under British rule, ultimately culminating in the fall of Singapore and the eventual partition of the nation into two separate religiously distinct states. Throughout the Cold War, India maintained its formal neutrality while informally entering into a strategic partnership with Russia to resist American diplomatic machinations and its chief geopolitical rivals, those being Pakistan and China. Following the end of the Cold War and the rise of China as a regional power, India has since taken on a more cooperative stance toward the U.S. in its effort to contain China. Constant throughout its timeline were the inherent geopolitical qualities of the country. Its maritime and northwestern vulnerabilities, as well as its disposition toward competition with China along its frontiers, are manifestations of these qualities that have influenced India as a unified state. Contextualized this way, India's past as well as its present can be better understood. Entering the 2020s, India faces a choice. With China and Russia increasingly acting in unison against American Eurasian goals, India must decide how far it wants to go in its newfound partnership with the United States. While recent moves by Indian and American policymakers would indicate that both sides are confident in the new direction that the relationship is going, the perennial geographic features of the subcontinent lend credence to those who doubt that the cooperation is the one that will last. For India, the policy going forward must be one of careful balance. On one hand, a blank check of support for America would alienate themselves from Russia, dangerously exposing them to whatever threats Moscow can muster on the subcontinent's vulnerable northwestern flank. Conversely, a rebuke of American interests to see China contained would only embolden Beijing in their pursuit of a Central and South Asian sphere of influence. Chinese economic power, as well as its growing military capabilities, threaten India on both its maritime and Himalayan frontiers. Though India would not be acting against Russian interests, Russia is still in favor of the same anti-unipolar goals for Eurasia that China is. No longer the stronger of the two, any partnership Moscow has with New Delhi may have to be subordinated in favor of appeasing Beijing. How India manages to negotiate its clear opposition to increased Chinese power while still retaining good relations with the Russians remains unclear. And of course, India must navigate this great power struggle all while dealing with the ever-present danger that a nuclear-armed Pakistan poses. But even though India's geopolitical situation may seem tenuous, its ace in the hole is its proven ability to navigate great power struggles throughout its history as a unified political entity. Its unique geographic position between the Himalayas and the Indian Ocean give it a significant level of strategic flexibility. Whatever challenges China poses now or in the future, its maritime capabilities are nowhere near what they must be if they were to pose the kind of threat Imperial Japan did in the Second World War. Additionally, partnership with the Indians or not, the Americans are unlikely to ever fully cede control of East Asia to China without some form of strategic accommodation. And though a measured partnership with the Americans may upset the Russians, was London not able to retain its crown jewel by engaging with and accommodating St. Petersburg? And for whatever doubts some American policymakers may have with regards to India's viability as a partner, the West's relations with the subcontinent since its colonization in the 15th century has proven just how integral a connection to India is if any Western state is to project power into the broader East Asia region. All these examples of India overcoming its own limitations happened at a time when India was not yet even a unified independent state, further highlighting the strength of contemporary India's position. If these great power traps could be navigated then, when India's foreign policy was subordinated to the whims of London, then what could it do now when its destiny is its own? In effect, the way forward for India remains unknown. Should Chinese ambitions grow and geopolitical trends quicken, it is likely the country will slide further into the American-led coalition to contain China. Flanked by a China-friendly Pakistan in China itself, India would be forced into this camp whether it liked it or not. But should China plateau in its growth, India's options become much less tied to Washington and its destiny is one that it can pursue independently. It will be able to pursue its close relationship with the Russians while still pursuing a cordial, if not arm's-length partnership with America in its limited containment of China's geopolitical goals. For India, the only certain thing at this point is uncertainty. But this uncertainty should not be viewed as a threat, but as an opportunity. From the Battle of Plassey to the fall of Singapore, India's geopolitical history has been one of extraordinary events and their cascading effects. Only time will tell which direction the world's largest democracy is headed. So, what do you think the future holds for India? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and share with others. If you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing as I'll be making more videos like this. Anyway, that's all for me today. My name is American Satrap. So long and take care.